Well, it may not look like it on the surface, but John's gospel is actually built around a very clear structure. Unlike the other gospels, which roughly follow a chronological telling of Jesus' life, John's gospel actually breaks the life of Jesus apart and groups the events and stories of his life in order to fit within a larger structure and to communicate a larger point. And so the gospel is really divided into two big parts. The first half of the book we refer to as the Book of Signs, and it tells the story of these 7 miracles or 7 signs that Jesus performed. And each of these signs that Jesus does are linked to an important structure, like the temple, or an important event, like a festival. And they're all trying to communicate something deeper about Jesus, hence the title Signs, right? They're pointing to something deeper. The second half of the book is called the Book of Glory, and it goes from about chapter 13 on to chapter 20 or chapter 21. And the gospel here focuses on the death and resurrection of Jesus. So, in other words, one full half of the gospel is devoted just to 1 week of Jesus' life. Well, our reading this week that's been assigned to us is from John chapter 12, verses 20 to 33. And I hope you've read it beforehand. It concludes the book of signs. But chapter 12 really serves almost like a transition chapter between these two books. The final sign that Jesus performs is actually in chapter 11, where Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. It's a sign, as you can well imagine, that's pointing to what is about to happen to Jesus himself, and for that matter, actually to all of creation, the resurrection of all things from the dead. Well, then we turn to chapter 12, and we read then these dialogue and events that foreshadow really what is about to come in the second book. At the beginning of the chapter, we watch as Jesus is anointed with oil, which is an act that really kind of foreshadows the coming embalming that's about to happen with Jesus a week later, where he is embalmed with perfume and spices and oils. And then in the middle of chapter 12, Jesus enters into Jerusalem. And we all know this story. We're about to read it, in fact, in a week or so time. We call it the triumphal entry. But as Jesus arrives into Jerusalem and we read the story, we all have this very ominous sense that something is not as it appears, right? That there are evil things that are lurking around in the backdrop. Well, after this scene of Jesus' triumphal entry, he begins then to make the foreshadowing of what's about to come in the Book of Glory even clearer. And speaking to his disciples then, he says what is the focus of the reading that we have for us today. And as I say, I hope you've already read it before watching this passage, or this short video. What's interesting about this is that at the beginning of our section that we're reading this week, he says to his disciples, the hour has come. Now, why is that interesting to me? Well, because in John chapter 2, in John chapter 7 and in John chapter 8, Jesus has actually repeated to the people that his hour has not yet come, that it's not yet his time. And it's kind of cryptic language that he's using. But now at the end of the book of signs, just as we're about to turn into the book of glory, Jesus says, now it is the time. His hour has come. Well, with that little bit of a backdrop as to what's taking place leading up to our passage today, I want to conclude this short little video on just something, the portion of the scripture that stood out to me when I read it. In verse 27, Jesus says this. Let me see if I can pull it up here. He says, "Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it was for this very reason that I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." And then the Father responds from heaven, "I have glorified it, and I'll glorify it again." Now, let me just make a comment about why this stood out to me. What grabbed me was that how often do I find myself saying a similar thing? Father, save me from this hour. I mean, I pray this prayer weekly. I pray this prayer daily. Save me from this or save me from that. Or, like I hate trouble. I hate pain. I hate suffering of all kinds. I would suspect that I'm not alone in this. I don't know of anybody that really likes pain or suffering. But the thing is, while this is a really natural human prayer that Jesus is suggesting that he may pray and that I pray and that probably you pray all the time, Jesus, who is called in the Gospels and who calls himself the Son of Man, which means the truly human one. In other words, he's demonstrating for us, or he's showing us what it means in God's eyes to be fully alive, to be a fully human one. Jesus chooses a different way. It's not where he ends up. This isn't the prayer that he prays, and in this he's showing us something. Instead, what he prays is he says, no, Father, glorify your name. He asks that in this trial that he knows is about to come to him, he asks that another, namely his Father, would be lifted up, would be exalted in this time. And when I read that, what stood out to me is that I think that this is the way that Jesus is calling us to live and to do life, that we would be people who at all times, that even in the face of suffering, that we are simply praying, God, in my life, would you be honored and would you be praised and would you be exalted? Could this be the vision of my life? This week I was reading a social media post. In fact, I think it was maybe even just yesterday. And it was going around on social media. And the person was asking this really thoughtful question. They were asking the people that were reading in to describe a vision for their life that was not attached to their vocation. As I say, it was a good question. And a lot of people were really struggling with the answer. A few people had thoughtful responses, but most were just, I don't know. And I think the person that was posting the question was saying, like, is your life, does it have meaning beyond what you do? What is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of your life? They were asking people to probe their heart and think about this question. But when I read the question that was being posed, what went to me was my mind turned again to these last verses of the Book of Ecclesiastes, which I have so often gone to over my life, where the writer of this wisdom literature, this ancient literature, after musing about life and pain and trials and the seasons of our life, to every time there is a season. And then so often concluding that life is like a vapor. He calls it meaningless. Life is meaningless, which can sound so dark on the one hand, but he's just describing this idea that it just is like, it's like a vapor. That's what the actual language means behind it. At the end of the whole of all of this wisdom, at the end of all of his musing, he arrives and he says this. Let me pull it up again. He says, now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear or glorify God and keep his commands, for this is the whole duty of a person. The writer of Ecclesiastes is saying, this is the vision for our life. That we would be a people that say along with Jesus, Father, glorify yourself in me. And thousands of years later, then the church would arrive or would carry on this thinking, and it would say this in the very opening clause of what's known as the Westminster Catechism or the Westminster Shorter Catechism. I think this was about the 1600s. It says this, that a person's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. Father, what shall I say in this time? Save me from this hour? No. But even in this trial, may I glorify you. May I live out my vision. May I do the whole duty of what it is that I'm called to do, which is to offer to you and to be a fragrant offering to you. And in this, as the Catechism says, to enjoy you forever. And as we read on, what we see in Jesus is that the suffering of our lives will be for a moment, but the enjoyment of God and the living for his glory will never end. And the experience of his kindness and his mercy, that is going to prevail forever and ever and ever, to enjoy him forever. And so with that, may the Lord give you all that you need to live out this vision in the days ahead. The Lord bless you and keep you this week.